Off the coast of California, something has gone quiet. The waters near the Farallon Islands, one of the most productive great white shark habitats on the planet, have been unusually still. No fins breaking the surface. No hunting behavior near the seal colonies.
No sharks.
For decades, researchers tagged and tracked the same individuals returning to these waters like clockwork. Every season. Every year. Reliable as the tides. Then, almost without warning, they stopped coming back. Marine biologists noticed it first in their data. Acoustic receivers planted on the ocean floor, devices that ping every time a tagged shark swims past, fell silent. Not for a day, not for a week, for months at a time. At first, no one panicked. Sharks move. They migrate. They follow prey. But this was different. The seals were still there. The water temperature was normal. The food was waiting. The sharks just weren't. A few researchers quietly started comparing notes. What they found was unsettling. Sighting numbers that had been climbing steadily for years had suddenly reversed. Tagging data showed animals moving in patterns nobody had seen before. Erratic, wide, almost desperate. Something was pushing them out, something was changing their behavior at a fundamental level. The question was what, and the deeper scientists looked, the more they realized the answer wasn't hiding in the water. It was coming from somewhere else entirely. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what these sharks meant to this coastline. The Farallon Islands sit about 30 miles west of San Francisco. Cold water, deep channels, dense marine life. For researchers, it was one of the most important shark study sites in the world. Scientists had been tracking great whites here since the early 1980s. Over time, they built something rare in marine biology, a long-term picture. Individual sharks, identified by their dorsal fins, returned season after season. They named some of them. They knew their sizes, their habits, their preferred hunting zones. This wasn't guesswork. This was decades of hard data. And that data told a clear story. By the 2010s, after years of conservation efforts, white shark numbers along the California coast were slowly recovering. It wasn't a boom, but it was progress. Researchers were cautiously optimistic. Then came the shift. Around 2017 and 2018, something began changing in the acoustic data. Tagged sharks that used to linger near the Farallons for weeks started cutting their visits short. Some vanished from the receivers entirely. Field teams doing aerial surveys reported fewer surface sightings near Point Reyes, near Ano Nuevo, near all the traditional aggregation sites. At first, the lead researchers floated the obvious explanations. Ocean temperatures fluctuate. Prey moving. Normal variation. But one detail kept nagging at them. The sharks weren't just leaving the Farallons. They were leaving the entire nearshore region, hundreds of miles of coastline, all at roughly the same time. That's not normal migration, that's avoidance. And whatever they were avoiding, the scientists hadn't found it yet. Marine biologists at Stanford's Hopkins Marine Station began pulling together every data point they had. Tagged sharks, aerial surveys, acoustic logs, prey population counts. They laid it all out and looked for a pattern. The seals at Ano Nuevo were thriving. Elephant seal populations, the great whites' preferred prey along this coastline, had actually increased. More food than ever, and yet the predators were gone. One researcher described it as walking into a restaurant fully stocked with food and finding every table empty. Something had scared the customers away. Something they couldn't see on the menu. The team widened their search. They started cross-referencing shark movement data with oceanographic records. Water temperature, salinity shifts, oxygen levels, algal bloom activity. Nothing matched the timeline cleanly. Then a wildlife biologist reviewing the tagging data noticed something that stopped him cold. The sharks weren't just leaving. Some of them were moving in a specific direction, pushing northwest into deeper, colder offshore waters. That was strange. Great whites near California tend to migrate toward warmer Central Pacific waters, an area researchers call the White Shark Cafe, during certain times of year. But this movement was happening outside that window. Off schedule. Off pattern, like something was hurting them. And then came the detail nobody had prepared for. One of the long-term tagged individuals, a large male that researchers had tracked for over 6 years, had his signal picked up near the Oregon border. He had never been recorded that far north. Not once in 6 years of data, something had fundamentally disrupted his range. The question wasn't just what was pushing the sharks away anymore. It was, What was powerful enough to override 6 years of instinct? The research team brought in outside help. A wildlife acoustic specialist was given access to the full archive of underwater audio recordings collected near the Farallon Islands over the previous 3 years. His job was simple. Listen for anything unusual. It took him 4 days. On the 5th day, he flagged something in a recording from the fall of 2018. Buried beneath the ambient noise of the ocean, the clicks of distant boat engines, the low hum of currents, there was a biological sound signature that didn't belong to any shark. It was a call. A specific, complex, repeating call. The kind made by highly intelligent, highly coordinated marine mammals traveling in a tight group. Orcas. Not just passing through. The acoustic pattern suggested they had been present in the area for an extended period. Circling, communicating, hunting. The team pulled historical orca sighting records for the region. What they found was striking. Transient orcas, the mammal-hunting ecotype, had been documented near the Farallon Islands before. Occasional visits. Rare but not unheard of. But something had changed in the frequency. Starting around 2017, sighting reports from whale-watching vessels and Coast Guard logs showed transient orca groups appearing near the islands more regularly, more boldly, staying longer. And every single documented orca presence near the Farallon Islands in that window corresponded with a sudden drop in shark activity at the acoustic receivers. Not a gradual decline, an immediate one. Within hours of the orcas arriving, the sharks were gone. One marine mammal researcher who reviewed the data said the response time was unlike anything he had seen in prey-predator displacement studies. The sharks weren't slowly drifting away. They were fleeing. But here's what made the scientists stop and look at each other across the room. Orcas had always visited this coastline. So why, suddenly, were the sharks so terrified? The answer started to emerge from an unlikely source. A marine biologist studying orca feeding behavior off the coast of South Africa had published a series of papers documenting something deeply unusual. A pair of transient orcas, identified as port and starboard by their distinctively collapsed dorsal fins, had developed a precise, repeatable technique for hunting great white sharks. Not chasing them. Not ambushing them randomly. Hunting them with surgical accuracy. Targeting the liver specifically, the largest, most fat-rich organ in a shark's body. What was once considered rare predator-prey behavior was becoming documented methodology, and it was spreading north. Researchers cross-referencing orca identification catalogs found that transient groups appearing near California showed behavioral signatures consistent with active shark predation, not just opportunistic encounters. These weren't curious orcas bumping into sharks. These were experienced hunters operating in new territory. But why now? Why California? Why this sudden escalation? That's when a fisheries ecologist entered the picture. He wasn't studying sharks or orcas. He was studying prey collapse, the long-term decline of certain fish populations along the Pacific coast. His data showed something quietly devastating. The species that transient orcas traditionally hunt in these waters, certain seal and sea lion populations in specific offshore zones, had shifted their distribution over the past decade. Warmer water anomalies, changing upwelling patterns, disrupted food chains cascading upward. The orcas' usual prey had moved. So the orcas moved too, closer to shore, into new feeding zones, into territory they had rarely needed before. And in that territory, they discovered the sharks, not as rivals, as prey. But even that wasn't the full picture, because when researchers looked at the scale of what was happening, the numbers, the range, the rate of shark displacement, one quiet, deeply unsettling question surfaced. Was this already too late to reverse? The researchers sat with that question for a long time. Because the honest answer was complicated. Great white sharks had spent decades slowly recovering along the California coast. Conservation protections, fishing restrictions, public awareness campaigns. It was one of the quiet success stories of marine preservation. And now that recovery was being unwound, not by humans, but by a chain of events that humans had quietly set in motion. The warming of Pacific waters had shifted prey populations. Shifted prey populations had redirected orca hunting ranges. Redirected orcas had discovered and exploited a new food source. And great whites, animals that had survived for over 400 million years, were being systematically pushed out of waters they had occupied for millennia. The displacement wasn't just local anymore. Acoustic tracking data showed sharks that had abandoned the Farallon Islands were spending extended periods in open ocean, far from their traditional hunting grounds, longer travel times, less efficient feeding, higher energy expenditure. Younger sharks, still developing critical hunting skills, were being displaced during the exact window when coastal proximity matters most. A generation of great whites learning to survive in the wrong place. The consequences were already rippling outward. With fewer white sharks patrolling nearshore zones, seal populations in certain areas began showing unusual density clustering, unchecked, unbalanced. Fish populations those seals depend on started showing early signs of pressure. Remove the apex predator long enough, and the entire system beneath it quietly begins to buckle. One ecologist put it simply, the ocean doesn't announce when it's changing. It just changes. And by the time the data is clear enough for anyone to act, the window to act is usually already smaller than it was. The sharks haven't disappeared forever. Tagging data still shows individuals returning, cautiously, briefly, before pulling away again. They haven't forgotten this coastline. They are waiting for whatever disrupted their world to settle back into balance. Whether that balance returns depends on decisions being made far from the water, in fisheries policies, in climate commitments, in the slow, unglamorous work of ecosystem management that rarely makes headlines. The ocean is patient. The question is whether we are too. If you want to keep following stories like this one, real, unfolding, quietly important, subscribing takes 1 second and means you won't miss what comes next.